Good day again. Shalom. This is Rabbi Richard Address, the host of our Seekers of Meaning podcast series, the podcast arm of Jewish Sacred Aging. Thank you for joining us. This is part of a series of podcasts that we're talking about as we approach the high holidays and the month of Elul and this turning of our own souls in introspection. And we're taking a look at some of the theological implications of these holidays for us. And we're pleased to announce and again remind you that Seekers of Meaning is brought to you by bookbaby.com. And this is an announcement for those of you out there. There may be one or two of you who are contemplating publishing your own book. You're writing your own book. You have a manuscript that you really don't know what to do with, and you want to publish it, but don't know quite how to do that. BookBaby provides all the creative services like editing, designing, formatting, printing, and most notably, they help you, the writer, become authors by managing the production, distribution, and payment processing for independent authors. And if you'd like more information about how to get involved with BookBaby and publishing your own book, their phone number is 877-961-6878. That's 877-961-6878. Or go visit them on the web at www.bookbaby.com. In our conversations in Elul about theology, we are very pleased to welcome to this edition of Seekers of Meaning, Rabbi Toba Spitzer, the rabbi of Dorsey Tzedek in Newton, Massachusetts, the author of this I don't know whether you can see this with the lights, God is Here, subtitled Reimagining the Divine, a very, very interesting and exciting new work. Toba, welcome to Seekers of Meaning. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you, and thanks for having me.
This is very, very interesting. I'm very happy that you're with us. Lots to talk about. The odds are we won't get through the page and a half of notes that I have from reading the book. But let me get started with a real simple, basic softball question that you sort of like look at the beginning of the book. Why do we need to believe in something?
I don't know if we need to believe in something. I just, I think we do. I think we all have values. We all have assumptions about how the universe works. So ultimately, it's really a question of what are we putting at the center of our lives, and around what are we orienting our lives? Not do I believe this or do I not believe this? When it comes to God specifically, my hope in the book is to really reframe the question from one of belief to one of experience. So while on the one hand, I do believe that there are belief systems that that shape us, and maybe in the terms of cognitive linguistics, there's frames through which we view reality. When it comes to the sacred, I'm making an assumption that I think is pretty valid, that human beings at all times and all places have had experiences of the divine, of the sacred, of holiness, however you want to call it. Even those who consider themselves secular have had those moments, those experiences, and we need language for it. And so the contention of the book is that some of the metaphors that we've used to frame that are difficult for people, some of the God language and God concepts. And that because of those difficult concepts, people have said, well, then I'm just not spiritual, or I can't have access to that, or I'm just going to leave, Jewish practice or any kind of religious practice because it's not meaningful to me. And then sort of throws out the baby with the bathwater. And we've got all this wonderful practices and teachings in our sacred texts. And the book is not just for Jews, although I use primarily Jewish texts to explore it. And it's the attempt to really come up with a new language, and the analogy I use a menu, a different menu for us. So I don't know if that's a broad answer to your question, but I think that's thinking that led me to write the book. Yeah,
because when you use the phrase "a new language," both in last week's podcast with Rabbi Kotak and Reverend McCall, and next week's podcast with a couple of other colleagues, they're all talking about the necessity in 2022 to perhaps create a new language. Everybody's using the same phrase, a new language around theology. So, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about this book, because you really talk about the framework of metaphor, which is fascinating. But first, I got to ask you to define a phrase you use, and it's also in the book. You introduced this phrase, I think, on page 8, cognitive linguistics. Cognitive linguistics. Now, I live down here near Philly, we got to keep things real simple for us Phillies fans. What is cognitive linguistics?
So I'll tell you, I'm a layperson in that field, so I'll tell you my understanding of it, and as not a linguist. So my understanding of the field is that it's based in the work of primarily, but not solely, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, who in 1980 published a book called Metaphors We Live By. And their contention as linguists was that human brains cannot function without metaphor. And when we interact with the world, we're using metaphor unconsciously. And some of the metaphors we actually know that we're using, but usually we're using metaphor and not knowing it. So a very basic metaphor is I see what you mean, which comes from a very early infant experience where if you don't see something, if the baby doesn't see something, it doesn't exist. So seeing is knowing is a conceptual metaphor in their system. So it's a field of linguistics. They explored this by looking at how we speak. But later in the 90s, with neuroscience, scientists started seeing that our brains it's actually shaping our brains. So one example in a book I read said that when we use the metaphor to kick a habit, that the part of our brain that activates our body to kick something is actually activated. That part of our brain is activated when we use that phrase. So the neurons are connecting. So cognitive linguistics, my understanding is, at least this part, the metaphor piece of it, I don't know the whole field, but is how language shapes not just our speech, but our experience and the use of metaphor in that. So the contention of the book is that usually when we're arguing about God, when we're having arguments about does God exist? Can God do this? Does God make sense? Why do bad things happen to good people? All of these classic sort of theological questions I'm suggesting are not really questions about God. They're questions about a metaphor that's implicit. Even if we don't believe it, it's in our brains, which is God is a big person. And once you're in that metaphor of God as a big person, it just shapes not just our liturgy or our sacred text, it actually shapes our experience of the divine. And what I found was that if I looked in our Jewish tradition specifically, we have so many other metaphors and they lift up other aspects of our experience. They make other questions possible and they make certain questions not relevant anymore. So cognitive linguistics is basically, I'm inviting people to take seriously metaphor for our purposes, and to take seriously the role that metaphor plays in how we engage with the world.
So let's examine perhaps in the High Holiday liturgy, the great metaphor. And you write about this in the book, the Unatana Tokef.
Mm-hmm.
Walk us through, the Unatana Tokef, because many of us have taught this as metaphor. But walk us through how you approach it within the book.
Right. So Unatana Tokef is both an incredible poem and problematic, and it actually uses a lot of it's a poem and it quite consciously uses different metaphors. It begins with God on a throne, seated on a throne. So implicitly God as a ruler of some sort. Then it shifts to a metaphor of writing. It's a little unclear who's doing the writing, whether God's doing the writing or we're doing the writing, but all of a sudden, the divine is related to having our fate written down in some way. And then the next thing we know, God is a shepherd, and with what that means, either counting sheep or caring for sheep. And then sort of the images for God actually disappear. And then we're just left with this sort of confrontation with our mortality, what will happen in the new year. And then in the end, it sort of shifts again. We have sort of this notion that God's name, like there's no end to the divine and that its name is our name. So it moves through all kinds of different metaphors if you really unpack it on a literary level. Unfortunately, I think the metaphorical impact, if we walk into the sanctuary and we're operating in this frame, and the word frame is a cognitive linguistics word, meaning it's literally a frame. It shapes how we experience reality and how we see reality. If we walk into the sanctuary and in our brains, whether we like it or not, is God as a big person, it's very hard for people to hear the Unatana Tokef and not hear there's some God up there writing down, sort of like Santa Claus, who's been good, who's been bad, and deciding what's going to happen to me in the new year. I actually don't think that's what the Unatana Tokef is saying at all. But if we're in that frame, it's very hard to hear it. Not with that way. And I do know people who just walked out of the sanctuary. They can't bear it. They're like, well, that means that my brother who got a terrible illness and died was a bad person. Right. And that's ridiculous. So I can't take this. So what starts as a sort of a poem and a literary evocation of standing before the universe and standing before the reality of our own mortality, which is true, becomes, because of this very constricting metaphor of God as a big person, becomes a theological, roadblock for people. So that, and it is true, the High Holiday Liturgy is full of God as ruler and God as king. But again, it's not the only metaphor in there, and it's not the only metaphor accessible to us. And one thing I've done at our synagogue is is available on our website, just written up a sheet that I have available out for people to pick up with different metaphors that invite people in. Another name we use during Kol Nidre is Rachamana. God is the compassionate one, is the womb. Beautiful metaphor, very different than a king on a throne, judging us.
So you expand that and move that. You quote James Kugel in one of his books about the belief in God versus the experience of God.
Yeah,
which I think is, many people who have been trained, perhaps academically, will say, I have to believe, I have to have proof. Vis-a-vis, I'm experiencing something of the numinous, of the sacred. I can't necessarily explain it. I can't necessarily prove it. But you also write somewhere in this conversation that people say, I don't believe in God or prove to me that God exists. Then you write, God exists like love exists, the experience. Could you walk me through, just unpack that a little bit about that confrontation?
Yeah. Yeah, and this is in the early chapters when I try to explore a little bit about another claim of cognitive linguistics is that we can't locate reality completely outside of us or completely inside of us. That as humans, we encounter the world through our brains. And what we understand as reality, what we experience as reality, really what reality is some interaction of our bodies, we're embodied beings, our brains, and reality out there. And and color is one example. Like color, light, we only know color because of our eyes and the way our eyes work, and light, reflecting off of surfaces. And then we get the spectrum of light. And light, it exists. Colors exist. But I can only know color through my body, my senses. How other creatures experience color, I have no idea. It's probably quite different than me. So that's a good example. Does color exist? Yes. How do I know it? How do I talk about it? How do I experience it? That's limited by my body. So that's more in the scientific realm. Time is another good example. Time exists. We can make mathematical equations about it, but how a human being experiences time is completely limited by our minds, our brains, our bodies. So I put love in that category. Most people have experienced love in some form. There's so many types of love. If I said to you, Richard, prove to me that, your mother loved you, or, or that you love whatever, you can't prove that to me. You tell me story. I've done this with third graders. I'm like, tell me your mother loves you. Prove it to me. And they tell me stories. Well, she tucks me in at night. She does this. She does that. So I sort of put the sacred or God or the divine, however you want to call it, in that category. It's a key component of human experience. It has shaped human beings forever. I think it's real. And we can only know it through our bodies and our minds, and therefore we need metaphor. And proof, I don't know, the whole proving thing seems to have been sort of a Christian scholastic exercise beginning sometime in the Middle Ages. I'm not really interested in that. I don't think it's particularly Jewish, to be honest. I feel like, our texts don't go around proving, God. But they make the rabbis say, there's a pretty early midrash, I think, where the rabbis say, God says, you are my witnesses. And if you were not my witnesses, ... They don't even finish the sentence. But to me, it's the rabbis implying, what is the divine without our experience of it? The other midrashim say we were created in order to witness, so there's something about our experience of the divine that is key to what the divine is. And if people want to say, well, that means it's just a thought in our heads, I would say no. I would say it's more than that. It shapes us. It's something to draw upon. We, like you said, we can't always give it clear words, but it's something we've experienced. And our only way to it is through metaphor, through language, through ritual, through our senses. That's the only way we can access it.
Yeah, we found in the work that we do at Jewish Sacred Aging this explosion of ritual, creative rituals, as we're living longer and experiencing new life stages, that people say, I'm experiencing this I never thought I'd live this long. I want something to mark it, to denote it, to embrace it. And there's this explosion of ritual. The book is really, as you keep saying and reminding, this is why it's so important, this idea of metaphor. And you talk about some of the classic metaphorical systems within Jewish tradition, like, the concept of mayim, of water, and the idea of hamakom, one of the names of God, the place, and hakol, the voice. These are classic, and it's filled with a liturgy. And in the high holidays, as well as Shabbat and Yom Tov in literature, talk to me about these phrases, especially the idea of water, which is a transformational symbol in various cultures, but specifically in us.
Yeah. Yeah, so I sort of discovered, and I sort of literally stumbled across a book in a bookstore about cognitive linguistics. I started thinking about metaphor, and I was like, so what other metaphors are available to us? And I just started exploring, and I was really actually surprised, like, water is one of the dominant metaphors for the divine in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh. In the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible, it's less an explicit metaphor of the divine, but it's very central. The Torah is written by people who live in a desert region. It's not surprising that water, is sustaining and life-giving. So it's, in the chapter on water, I explore all the things that water means in the Torah, and then in the later books of the Bible, especially some of the prophets and the Psalms, God is very explicitly linked to water. And there are what I would call water names of God. Makor Mayim Chayim, the fount of living waters. Peleg Elohim, river of God. Nachal Adanecha, the river of your bliss. And I realized, this is not just literary phrases. This isn't just nice poetry. I think our ancestors called God by these names. And I think water is a very powerful way to experience the divine. And in each, so in the book, I have a chapter on the different metaphors. Most are from nature, and I think we share that with all religious and spiritual traditions. That's the created world is where the divine manifests. And I have practices to try to connect that. I live on the East Coast. Even though we're in a little bit of a drought right now in Boston, there's a lot of water, so we tend to take it for granted. So how do we reconnect to this? So one of the things I'll say about metaphor is that in what I learned from cognitive linguistics is that a metaphor has to be grounded in an embodied experience. So, so we start with our physical experience. Water is so many things. It's nourishing. It's life-sustaining. It's dangerous, right? It's it's potentially overwhelming. It's something we need to navigate. There's so many aspects of it. So I start knowing water because I am a human being and I've encountered water my whole life. And then it makes it very easy to apply that to the realm of the divine. And I think this is important because I think when the only metaphor for the difficult is God is a big person, we tend to have questions like, why is God doing this to me? Or why is this happening to me? Because we're assuming that there's a person out there hurting us.
Mm-hmm.
But when we try something like water, it's like, well, I know water's dangerous. I know water is both life-giving and can drown me. And the example I give in the book is when, my spouse was dying of cancer and I had to sit with it. And there was a chant that talked about, not being overwhelmed by the water. And that was so much more useful to me. So instead of sitting there thinking like, why is this happening to me or to her? I was thinking, wow, this is really overwhelming right now. And I know there is the divine. I can still access the divine in this moment. How do I find it? Where is God in this? How do I navigate this really difficult situation? Which I personally find a much more useful question than why is this happening to me? Questions aren't good or bad. I just think they're helpful or unhelpful. Like, why is this happening to me is not, I don't find a particularly helpful question. How do I navigate this? Wow, that's a really helpful question.
Right.
And that's where ritual comes in. That's where, so I feel like, when we shift the metaphor, we shift the questions we're asking and we shift the answers we might receive. And that's really powerful.
It's also, I think you mentioned this towards the end of the book about individuals have a series in their life of spiritual choice points, the bechira, you call it, or you refer to it. But that's why is this happening to me? Or how can I make certain choices that will allow me to deal with this? Those are some of those choice points. You elaborate the idea of metaphor. You channel Exodus 3 with the Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. and this idea of God is this process of becoming. I mean, which is channeling your Mordecai Kaplan, which is cool. But it also shifts. Talk to me a little bit how you understand the Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, because it's very, very powerful chapter. It's a very great chapter.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, before I discovered the metaphor theory, I was really into process theology, which is mostly a Christian theology, although there are some Jewish folks who've written about it, Jewish theologians. And it does, I don't think, he wasn't exactly a process theologian, but Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, definitely was influenced, I think, by Alfred North Whitehead, who was the founder of process thought. But it's ancient, right? It's in our text, this notion that God is not a thing, not a being. And this chapter is a little bit different than the other chapters, where I focus a little more on sort of physical experience, like water, rock, place that you mentioned. But I think the notion of God as a process or as becoming is in our text, and it's quite explicit there in, when Moses gets that answer, right? Who are you? Who is this God talking to me? And the answer is, I will be that I will be. That's pretty wild. And process theology really quite beautifully talks about the divine as the source of potential and possibility in the world. That if there wasn't something that makes this moment different than the moment that just passed, we would just be continually repeating ourselves, repeating things. And the founder of process thought, Alfred North Whitehead, who was a mathematician and a philosopher and an atheist who then come up with his own idea of what God was in the early 20th century, said, well, if there is something in the universe that allows for newness, that's the divine. The divine is the potential for newness in the universe, which I find very, very beautiful and compelling. So in that chapter, I explore becoming. What does it mean to be becoming? How do we continue to become? How do we know? What does it mean to know that there's also certain constraints I have. I can't become you, and I can't become a frog, and I can't become a tree. Like I can only become a better Toba. How do I do that? And I feel like our tradition is quite adamant that we are accompanied by the divine in that endeavor, that God wants us in some way to become our best selves. And that's what God says to Moses. That's what Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh says to Moses at the bush, like, Ehyeh imach, this power of becoming will be with you when you go on this incredible journey to liberate a people. There is something divine that will accompany you in that.
We're speaking with Rabbi Toba Spitzer, the author of a recently published book, God is Here, Reimagining the Divine, the book available, imagine, at many, many bookstores, as well as the great God Amazon. And
go to bookshop.org. I like to promote independent bookstores. You can get it at bookshop.org. Yeah, from all kinds of places.
Bookshop.org. And speaking of books, and before we conclude, the last thing I want to ask you about is this really a wonderful image of the GPS. So, but because we're talking about books, again, back to some of you who may have a manuscript and want to know what to do with it. And since we are people of the book, a reminder from a book baby that self-publishing isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. If you have your own set of goals, so reaching them requires a unique set of tools. Book babies custom packages make it easier to decide what your book needs and provide it all in one convenient order. They've helped thousands of authors publish successfully and will be by your side throughout the entire process. Again, if you'd like to check out Book Baby and talk to somebody about publishing your own manuscript, give them a call at 877-961-6878. That's 877-961-86878. And their website, www.bookbaby.com. That's bookbaby.com. You have this wonderful image in the book, the GPS. Now, some of us computer challenged people know that if I can talk to somebody in there and they'll tell me how to get from point A to point B. But your GPS is the godly processing system.
Positioning.
Did I get
the
that
godly
right?
Positioning system, yes.
Godly positioning system. So
Right.
what is the godly positioning system? It's great. I mean, I was looking at it. It's great.
Right. Well, I just, as I was writing the book, I was like, I want to do one chapter that's about, more modern metaphors, not just these ancient ones. And there are two in the last chapter. So one is electricity. The other is GPS. I don't know exactly what started me thinking about this, but I realized that I think, there are these moments when we wish there was some voice on the dashboard, like, telling us exactly where to go, right? It doesn't really happen that way, at least not for me, but, not physically where to go. But so I sort of doing a little research on what, GPS is, and there are these different pieces of it, right? There's the actual locational system. There's the first that you have to know where you are. And then there's this idea that our device is like pinging off of satellites so that I know where I am. And that connects, I think, in our tradition to, over and over in Tanakh, in Hebrew Bible, especially the Torah, these moments where someone says, Hineni, here I am. Like before we can do anything sort of on a spiritual path, we have to know where we are. So that's the first step in godly positioning system. The second is the map, right? The only way the GPS works is that somebody has put in all these maps. Sometimes the maps are wrong and you end up in a field. I've had that experience, And I think that was an interesting metaphor for our religious systems, because like maps, they have to be constantly updated, right? There's parts of our tradition that are painful, that are not helpful. And we either have to like erase that part of the map or readjust it or rewrite it in some way, because we can only get from here to there if we have a good map. And that becomes practice, that becomes tradition, that becomes ritual, right? Rituals that you just talked about. Those are maps that get us where we want to get to. And finally, things like Google Maps or Waze or other systems have a feature where users can put in, information in real time. Oh, there's a police car up ahead. Slow down. Oh, there's a traffic accident. So there's this constant updating, and that I think for me was a beautiful metaphor of spiritual community. Like we don't do this alone. There really are no spiritual religious traditions where you're off by yourself. I mean, you might be sitting by yourself, but somehow, in some way, you are supported by tradition. You are supported by others doing the practice around you. I'm about to go on a silent retreat. I will be in a room with 100 people, not speaking. We're not talking to each other, but we're supporting each other. So, my congregation is that kind of a community. So this last aspect, sort of, I'm not traveling this road alone. So GPS to me is a beautiful metaphor for the spiritual path and for, a path of practice as well as sort of spiritual nurturing.
And in truth, with the high holidays coming up, that's perhaps the ultimate GPS within our tradition.
Right, the metaphor of turning. Right,
right.
Am I on the right path? Do I need to adjust, make some radical course correction because I'm on the wrong path? It's very powerful.
It fits. That's why I wanted to make sure that you talked about it, because it really does fit everything. Yeah. Rabbi Toba Spitzer, thank you very, very much. This is good luck with the book.
Thank you.
And just stay safe and stay healthy. I appreciate your time. And just be well. Be well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
And to all of you who have joined us today on today's edition of Seekers of Meaning, thank you very much for joining us. Again, a reminder of our sponsor, bookbaby.com is the website. Check it out. So that if you have a manuscript that you would like, and I thank them for their sponsorship. By the way, if you would like to become a sponsor of these podcasts, please get a hold of me. Feel free to email me at rabbi@jewishsacredaging.com. You can also check out the website, jewishsacredaging.com, and the Jewish Sacred Aging Facebook page. Again, we thank you for your time, and we look forward to joining you at the next Seekers of Meaning. And a big shout out before we conclude to our producer, Steve Lubetkin, because the Seekers of Meaning are produced at the broadcast centers of Lubetkin Media Companies here in bucolic, gorgeous, lovely Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And thank you again, Steve. To all of you, thank you again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at our next Seekers of Meaning. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, be kind to one another. Shalom.